Hey there everybody, this is going to be the proper episode 6 of Loco Profiling. And it's going to be a bit of a special one, because for the first time, I'm not going to look at an individual locomotive. This time, I'm actually going to cover a whole class. Not to mention, for the first time, we're diving outside the United Kingdom and the United States. We're going to continental Europe for this one, specifically Germany. Now the main reason is basically that this episode is going to be somewhat of a commemoration to Sabine Schmitz. And in case you don't know who that was, she was a German female racing driver who won the 24-hour endurance race at the Nürburgring in Germany twice in a row. So, yeah. Therefore, along with having driven there about 15 to 20,000 times, she was known as the Queen of the Nürburgring. And she made a few appearances on Top Gear in some of the later seasons, actually as a host after the end of the Clarkson era. But unfortunately, last month she sadly passed away at the age of 51 due to having cancer for the last several years, which was very unfortunate. So you're probably wondering, why are you doing this for her when she had no interest in steam locomotives? Well, I felt like it was only the right thing to do, and we are going to cover a very specific class of steam locomotives for her. Germany's fastest steam locomotives. Ladies and gentlemen, this one's for Sabine. Loco Profiling episode 6, the proper episode 6 that is. It's going to be on the Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft Baureihe 05. In 1920, all the various railway companies in Germany had nationalized and merged together into a single big cohesive railroad, the Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft, and immediately it became clear that standardization was the answer to the problem of maintaining various locomotives of various constituent companies. There was no standardization between them. So in 1925, the Einheits program was introduced, comprised of various different steam locomotives of various classes with, you guessed it, standardized parts, simplifying design, construction, etc., etc., etc. And the beauty of these standardized parts was that they could be swapped not just between two different locomotives of the same class, but also two different locomotives of completely different classes. As part of the Einheits program, the second biggest locomotives were the Baureihe 05, with the word Baureihe being German for locomotive class or series. However, you will be forgiven for thinking that they weren't good standardized locomotives because, well, they were pretty damn unique. Although they did use some standardized parts like the preheaters, air compressors, and feed water pumps, etc., they were pretty much in a league of their own. The whole shtick of being relatively iffy or poor standardized locomotives is even further highlighted where you consider the very low production run. Just 3 of them were built, numbered 05001 through 003. And because these were built between 1935 and 37 at the Borsig Locomotive Works in Germany's capital city, Berlin, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they weren't designed as such for railroading, but more so for politics, as great big tools of Nazi propaganda, because, well, it was still the 30s, and, well, Adolf Hitler was in charge of the country. Really, this whole politics shtick is the most highlighted when the prototype locomotive briefly carried the swastika on the sides of the smokebox during the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Why?
Das war ein Befehl!
Although you couldn't see it that well thanks to their streamlining, the 05s were triple-cylindered 464 Hudsons. And although their tractive effort wasn't perhaps that impressive or exciting, some of the tractive effort-related geometry was. The least exciting variable for the tractive effort was the cylinders. Granted, they had 3 cylinders each, but the size wasn't particularly impressive. 450 by 660 millimeter. Or 17.72 by 25.98 inches. Which is, if we're going to round it off to full inches, that'll be 18 by 26, but I'm being a bit more precise here. So the cylinders, bit small. The same couldn't be said for the driving wheels, however. They were in fact fucking enormous. 2.3 meters. So 2,300 millimeter, or 90.6 inches. And keep in mind, these were built for standard gauge. 80-inch driving wheels are already big for standard gauge locomotives. These things had over 90-inch driving wheels. And then there's the boiler pressure, which actually differed a little bit, because the 05003 was actually built a little later with a slightly lower boiler pressure compared to the other two. But it was still pretty damn impressive at 20 bar, or 290.08 psi for the 05003. As for the 05001 and 002, they had an even more extreme boiler pressure of 20.7 bar, which equals 300.2 psi. The overall tractive effort would be 33,302 pounds for the 05003 and 34,463 pounds for the 05001 and 002. Yeah, their driving wheels and boiler pressure made them pretty goddamn extraordinary by German standards. Like they were a proper class of super locomotives. But even if they weren't standardized, they were still successful, and the biggest trump card of the 05s was speed. On February 25th of 1936, the 05002 was used for a press trip from Hamburg to Berlin, where the engine reached a top speed of 175 kilometers per hour, roughly 110 miles per hour. This became the top speed for which the 05s were rated, but if it was up to the DRG's management, they weren't done yet. Later that same year, on May 11th, the 05002 was at it again on the same journey. This time, it was gunning for the world speed record. Near the town of Friesack, it smashed the record, storming past at 200.4 kilometers per hour, which equals 124.5 miles per hour. It remained the fastest steam locomotive in the world, until the London and Northeastern Railway in the United Kingdom used their A4 Pacific number 4468 Mallard for a record run on July 3rd of 1938. However, there are people who don't support this record, due to Mallard not maintaining the top speed for very long, and apparently doing it on a slight downhill grade. Instead, they side with the 05, for the argument that it held its highest recorded speed for a substantial amount of time, and it reached it on level track. Needless to say, that day thundered the 05s into god-tier status among steam engines. But then again, there were a pair of particularly interesting problems. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that they weren't that standardized. We already kind of discussed that. You may have already guessed one of the problems. They were streamlined. Yes, it made them aerodynamic, but the German way of streamlining has proven to be extremely problematic when it came to maintaining the locomotive underneath. It was a nightmare, and that was just a case on a 2-cylinder locomotive. On a 3-cylinder locomotive like the 05s, it was even more of a nightmare. And as for the second problem, it was the 05003. Mainly, when it was first built, not only was it streamlined like the other two, but it was also a coal-fired cab-forward locomotive. I get it. The Germans were essentially masochistic sluts for complicated engineering, but you don't have to go that far because you've overdone it in this case. So with these two big problems, it's fair to say that these locomotives weren't that popular with the maintenance crews. And after the Second World War, all three engines of the Baureihe 05 ended up in West Germany. The Deutsche Bundesbahn, the new railroad that would serve all of West Germany after the war, was actually kind of reluctant to take these engines onto their roster, but they entered service anyway in 1951, following a comprehensive rebuilding program to completely remove the streamlining and turn the 05003 into a more conventional locomotive. Afterwards, all three engines burned coal, and they were largely used for big passenger trains. But they did the job pretty well. Though it's interesting to note that the 05003 was still a little bit different compared to the other two. The 05001 and 002 had a completely clamped smoke box door, whereas the 05003 was one of very few steam engines in West Germany to use a screw wheel in the sense of a smoke box dart in the middle of the door. Furthermore, the L5003 was the only one of the class to have the air compressor and feed water pump mounted within the sides of the smoke box, as opposed to hanging in front of the driving wheels like on the other two. And then there's the slightly different trailing bogie. For whereas the 05001 and 002 had bogies that included side frames which covered the trailing wheels, the 05003 was unique because its trailing bogie didn't have any side frames, leaving the wheels exposed for all to see. Minor differences in the grand scheme of things, but there was also a pretty big new similarity between all of these engines. Their boiler pressure was reduced to the more standard boiler pressure of German steam engines, 16 bar, which equals 232.06 psi. This had the effect of lowering the tractive effort to 26,641 pounds. Still pretty powerful, but you can definitely tell that now the engines were a bit more standardized. Regardless, they remained in service with the Deutsche Bundesbahn throughout the 1950s, following the completion of their rebuild and modernization and standardization, if you will, in 1951 to when they were retired in 1958. Lastly, the 05003 was a little bit unique in other areas too, mainly that the tender looked a little bit different, and it was the only one of the class to feature the larger, elephant ear-shaped Wagner smoke deflectors for a little bit, though these were later replaced with the smaller and more traditional Witte smoke deflectors that you would see on a lot of other German locomotives. Plus, the 05003 also ventured as far west as the town of Arnhem in the Netherlands one time. Imagine that. But ultimately, despite the 05003 perhaps being the most well-traveled, I guess, for making it all the way to Arnhem that one time, and the 05002 smashing the world speed record, both of these locomotives ended up being broken up for scrap in 1960, leaving only the 05001 preserved. Today, it resides at the Transport Museum in Nuremberg, and unfortunately, most of its streamlining has returned. Some of the engine underneath is visible, but nowhere near enough as far as I'm concerned. So, to end the video, here's a small montage of the non-streamlined 05001 that I built in Gmod, pulling a small passenger train comprised of 5 cars. As they say in German, gute Fahrt. Auf Wiedersehen, Sabine Schmitz.